All right, so now it's time for part two. And you might want to settle in. This is going to be a long one. This is a huge topic. And like I said in part one, I'm trying to talk about all of segregation as one big topic, from the origins, which is what we talked about last time, talking about some of the ideological and quote unquote scientific origins of it and some of the early implications. Now in part two, we're going to look at, when it became finalized and then how did it play out. And this is really the big one. And as I said in part one, I warned that this would be an ugly one. And as we get close to the end of this lecture, this is when it really starts to get ugly. We're going to see some pretty brutal photos, probably some of the worst stuff you've seen. We're going to see by the end of this. And as I said before, I tend to be quite sensitive about not being insensitive or exploitive about showing, images of violence or images of people who are dead. But I do think at times you can't just talk about it. You have to see it, because it's I think the term we like to use is you need to bear witness to this. Okay, let's get started. So the other day we talked about some of the reversals from Reconstruction. For instance, the changes in how elections were done, things such as the poll tax and the grandfather clause. The last sort of step before we get to formal official Jim Crow was the Supreme Court. Because as you probably were already thinking when you were listening to part one, was like, wait a minute, this is clearly unconstitutional. The intent of the Constitution was that everybody's a citizen and all citizens should be allowed to vote. And those things that were happening were clearly going around that. And usually in America, whenever there's a question about constitutionality, it's the Supreme Court that rules. And in 1896, the Supreme Court finally ruled on the beginnings of segregation. So in Louisiana, there was an early law, early being about 1890, 1891. There was an early law in Louisiana to separate train cars. So in other words, one train car was for whites and one train car were for African Americans, right? And there were a lot of people in Louisiana that didn't like where this was heading. They could see that this was basically going back to racial segregation and racial oppression. So they decided to challenge the law. And the way you challenge the law is you actually break the law, you get arrested, and then it goes through the court system. And what you're hoping is that the courts will say, this is an unfair law, we're going to throw it out. So they decided in Louisiana, a small group of people, a multiracial group, decided we are going to challenge the law. And so a guy named Homer Plessy, that's who's supposed to be in this drawing you see here. This is from a newspaper. Homer Plessy was going to challenge the law. He was an African American who was going to purposely buy a ticket for a white train car in Louisiana. And then when he got on the train, he would be arrested. He didn't look like what you see in this drawing. Unfortunately, we don't have any photos of Homer Plessy. But by all descriptions, he would have looked like this gentleman. Sometimes if you Google Homer Plessy for images, this is the image that pops up. This was actually a Louisiana politician. I believe he was lieutenant governor for a brief period. And he was legally black. Basically in the United States, and I think unofficially, this is really still the case today, if you have any African-American background, no matter whether it is your great-great-great-grandmother or not, and everyone else could be white, but if your great-great-grandmother was black, legally you were considered black. It's called the one drop of blood rule. And so this gentleman would have been obviously biracial and could have passed as white, but he would have been seen as black. And Homer Plessy, the official term, although we don't use these terms anymore, is octoroon, which means he was 1/8 African-American, 7/8 European-American, in other words, white. And that was kind of on purpose. And so Homer Plessy went to buy a train ticket that they sold it to him because they assumed he was white. And then when he got on the train, he said, I'm black. Everybody, I'm black. I know I look white, but I'm black. I'm black. I'm black. Everybody, look, I'm black. You know, and absolutely, it did happen. The train conductor had him arrested and had, sent him away to jail, which is why it's called Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy, Homer Plessy, the African American. Ferguson is the owner of the railroad, and so because it was one of his employees that ended up having him arrested, he sued. Basically, it was a case between the two of them. Eventually, it made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. It took several years, but it became a Supreme Court ruling. And even though there was one justice that ruled differently, the consensus of the court was, and you probably know this already, the consensus of the court was that it is okay to segregate people, that is totally constitutional, as long as everything you provide is equal. It could be separate, but it must be equal. And, first off, before we even get into equality and were things equal, is that in itself constitutional? Maybe you're married to somebody of a different race. You want to be together. And these laws are basically saying you can't ride on the train together. Some states, you can't marry each other. So, already we can see a lot of problems with this. But let's even just take it at the face value. Okay, you're separate, you're forced to be separate, but equal. They're all equal. Well, who decides on this equality? Well, it's the people with power, the politicians of power, and the voters. Remember what's already happened before this is we already see the vast majority of African Americans are not able to vote. So they don't have a say in this. It'd be like if I had, again, a big pizza and I'm going to divide it out between all the students, and I give one student a really big piece and I give this other student a little tiny piece. And of course, the student with the tiny piece says, that's not fair. And I say, well, you don't get a say in this. I decide. And I'm going to say they're all equal. And that's exactly what happened. What we find is that there never was equality. They were not the same schools. They were not the same train services or police services. And in fact, a lot of communities, what would happen was you would have the white school, and very often you wouldn't even have a black school. Because think about it, the South was already poor. And this law is saying that if you're going to segregate, you have to have equal services, equal colleges, equal public schools. South can hardly afford one public school system, let alone two public school systems. So the reality is that even based on this argument, which is flawed to begin with, but again, take it at its argument, even on the argument of separate but equal, it failed because there never was true equality across the board. So what starts to happen, I mean, we were already seeing some of these laws go into place in local communities or local counties, but there was always some question, can we do this? Are we allowed to segregate people? Well, once Plessy versus Ferguson happens, that's basically the federal government going, you're allowed to do this. And so in the late 1890s and throughout the 20th century, all the way up till the 1960s, you see a whole plethora of segregation laws. The term became Jim Crow laws. We're not exactly sure why the term Jim Crow. Jim Crow goes back to the 1830s. In fact, you see this person here, a guy named Rice, who was a dancer and a singer in the 1830s. He was known as a minstrel singer. He was a white performer that wore blackface and pretended to be African American. And a song he used to sing and dance was called Jump Jim Crow. Now, how we get from that song, and it was a character too of Jim Crow, how we go from this character and song of Jim Crow in the 1830s to by 1900 calling segregation Jim Crow, we don't actually know. I actually know people who have tried to figure, like, where did that come? We don't know where that started. But we do know that if you look in law books, like the laws of Georgia, the laws of Florida in, say, 1905 or 1908, you can look in the index and they will be listed in the index, Jim Crow laws. So that became the legal term for segregation. That's why sometimes I say Jim Crow instead of segregation. But again, even though we have Plessy versus Ferguson and we have some early laws, a lot of places were still a little bit hesitant. So as I said earlier, there's not really one moment that we go from free to segregation. But the closest thing we have to sort of a Pearl Harbor, of course, Pearl Harbor, the event that started World War II, or the assassination of Franz Ferdinand that started World War I, or 9/11 that started the War on Terror. The closest thing we have to a Pearl Harbor for Jim Crow is Wilmington, North Carolina, a major race riot there in 1898. And really this moment, sort of, once this happened, this sort of opened the floodgates. Along with Plessy versus Ferguson, this opened the floodgates to Jim Crow. It's really after 1898 that we truly see the South start to embrace segregation fully. So let me tell you a little bit about this. This is one of these incredibly important stories that I find very few people are familiar with. In fact, it's only fairly recently that you're beginning to hear anything about this. This is just simply one of those events that's been rather probably purposely forgotten about. So Wilmington, North Carolina, I think I even mentioned the city in the first lecture. This is considered one of the freest cities. In fact, the quote was the freest city for Negroes in the US. That was a Black journalist wrote that in the early 1890s. And it was a city that you saw a lot of progress. I mean, Atlanta had a bit of this. Macon had some of this. Even Jacksonville, Florida, where I'm from, had some of this. We've already talked about some of the Black successes that we're seeing in the 1890s, but nothing really compared to Wilmington, North Carolina. Not only do we see politically, it's quite different from the rest of the South. Most of the South by the 1890s was Democrat. That was primarily the white party. That was the party that promoted segregation. Most white voters would have voted Democrat in the South, while most Black voters would have voted Republican. But again, there weren't many Black voters in the South. But in Wilmington, a combination of populist and Republicans, and they called themselves the Fusion Party, they ran Wilmington. There was a Republican mayor. There was a Republican postmaster. 10 of the 26 police officers were Black. 3 of the 10 city council members were Black. It was an African-American jailer. So the person arresting both Black and white citizens was an African-American. There were the coroner of the city was Black. Several of the health inspectors of the city were Black. I mean, this is kind of unlike in even cities that we see up north at this time. This was quite remarkable. And you may not be surprised that there was a lot of anger in the white community about this. This gets back to culture and status. So this is a pretty deep story. We're going to keep it very simple today. So in 1898, a Georgian woman named Rebecca Latimer Felton, she would have looked like more on the right. She lived for a very long time. So most people know her as this sweet old lady who, was about making the South better. But when she was probably the most active was when she was much younger. And she wrote, gave a speech, but she also wrote some articles saying the same thing. But there was a speech that was well reported on Tybee Island in Georgia. It was to an agricultural society meeting. And that week she gave this speech, there had been 5 lynchings. Now I'm going to get into lynchings later, but very quickly, a lynching is a public murder of somebody. And it usually happens when a community thinks that somebody is guilty and they don't think the police are going to do anything about it, they will then kill the person themselves. And obviously it's illegal, it's a horrible thing. And we're going to get into lynchings later. But 5 people were lynched, 5 Black men were lynched that week for the rape of white women. And this is something we're going to see over and over again. The justification for segregation, the justification for lynchings on the premise of the rape of white women. It, of course, happens sometimes, but in many cases it was consensual relationships. And in a lot of cases, it probably didn't happen at all. But this was considered like the ultimate crime at that time. Anyway, she wrote, well, excuse me, I keep saying that. She gave a speech about this. She later wrote about it as well, but she gave a speech and she said this is horrible. Not horrible because 5 Black men were lynched. No, in fact, she loved that. That was wonderful. She was angry that 5 white women were raped. And she was really kind of pointing out that you white men should be doing more for the white woman of the South. You were supposed to protect us, and you are not doing this. Now, back to Wilmington. Wilmington, again, has this very active Black community. They're very active politically. And a guy named Alexander Manley, who was born in Raleigh, North Carolina, but now lived in Wilmington. He owned one of the local papers. There were a couple of newspapers in the town. He owned one of them, the Wilmington Record. He bought this with his brother Frank. And this is Alexander Manley, by the way. He was legally African-American. He was mixed race, but he identified as Black. He was legally seen as Black. And so he ran this paper for African-Americans. As he said, this is a newspaper by Negroes, for Negroes. That was sort of its mantra. And he had already spoken out against early attempts at segregation in the country. He spoke out against Plessy versus Ferguson. And so Mrs. Felton gave this speech, and it was reported all over the country. And everybody was kind of looking like, what is Manley going to say about this in the Wilmington Record? At first, he didn't say much. But finally, in August, and this is the paper, and this is the actual issue. Unfortunately, it's almost impossible to read nowadays. But on August 18th, 1898, he responded in an editorial. And obviously, you don't need to write this down. You're not going to have to memorize this, but just I have it up here more for me than you. But again, what he said was, every Negro lynched is called a big, burly Black man, when in fact, many of those lynched had white men as fathers. And by the way, including Alexander Manley. Anyway, they had white men as fathers and were not big and burly, but sufficiently attractive for white girls of culture to fall in love with. Don't think ever that your white women will remain pure while you are debauching our women. Wilmington, and pretty much nowhere in the South, had anybody really read anything like this. And definitely not something written by an African American. He is saying that he's calling out the South, the white South. He's saying, you guys keep saying rape, and you're saying rape by these savage, brute rapists. He said, that's not happening. He said, in fact, a lot of these men are part white. They had white fathers. And these were consensual relationships. These are not relationships of rape. And he's also saying, and he's right about this, it was very common for white men, especially middle-class white men, to, in the evenings, to go down to what was known as the Black Quarters and go to Black-owned juke joints and dance halls and dance with Black women and have sexual relations with Black women, but not talk about it. Then go back to your wives and pretend it didn't happen. He's calling them out on this. This is, I mean, every sentence here is problematic, and it just gets more and more problematic for the white. I mean, the entire town, the white town part of the town, just cannot believe it. And even many of the Black residents are like, "Oh, this he went too far." Anyway, but at the same time, in many ways, Manley was correct in what he said. Anyway, so there were already some residents, white prominent residents of Wilmington, that were wanting to install full-on segregation, full-on racial oppression. They were Democrat, they were tired of Republicans being in charge, and they were absolutely tired of African Americans being in charge. And they'd already been planning how they're going to go about doing this. And by the way, we know this. We have their diaries, we have letters. They later bragged about this. So this is not some secret thing. They were pretty upfront about this. One of these men that had already been meeting to talk about this, because 1898 is an election year for the local community, for the state legislature in North Carolina. So one of these guys is Josephus Daniels. Now, he's not a common name today. But later, he will go on to be, under Woodrow Wilson, the Secretary of the U.S. Navy. He was the Secretary of the Navy during World War I. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They were friends. When Franklin Roosevelt became president in 1932, he appointed Daniels to be the ambassador to Mexico. So I want you to keep this in mind about all the names I'm talking about. These aren't just, some crazy Klan member that did some wacky thing and went away. These are the leaders, not only of Wilmington, but like in his case, they're going to become the leaders of the country. So today, when we're debating about race in America and about history, and we're debating about statues and the names of buildings. This is why it's so complicated, because, many people, if they know this guy, they know him as the Secretary of the Navy. They may not always realize that he was involved in some pretty dark stuff before he got to there. Anyway, Daniels is ready to change the situation in Wilmington. He's already starting to work with the white newspaper. He's working with a guy named Colonel Alfred Moore Waddell. He was a Confederate veteran. He never was actually a colonel. It was really common in the, like Colonel Sanders of KSA. It was really common for Southern white men of a certain stature to sometimes kind of adopt these military. You see this all this, in particular the term colonel. Usually if you were some kind of veteran in the war, because the idea was you're still involved. The war is over with, so you've risen up. He was a lieutenant in the war. Anyway, Colonel Moore, Moore Waddell, as he was known. He also worked with Daniels on this, and they got together and they said, look, we're going to lynch this Manley guy. And then Daniels said, it's not quite right yet. We're going to wait till the election, but we're going to make sure the election goes a certain way. So they were beginning to publish articles that was really speaking out against the Black community and look what's going on in the rest of the South. We need to be like them. During that fall of 1898, several prominent politicians came to town, including the governor of South Carolina, a guy named Ben Tillman. His nickname was Pitchfork Ben Tillman. He would later go on to be a U.S. senator, one of the most powerful politicians in America in the early 20th century. When you see Hollywood movies and they have the racist, the stereotypical racist Southern politician, they're almost always doing Ben Tillman. A lot of racism, even back then, was kind of subtle. A lot of it was kind of hidden. Tillman didn't hide it. He very famously once said that he would rather his daughter be eaten by a tiger than date a black man. And he meant it. He was not joking when he said that. He came and spoke to town and said, look, guys, you guys got to do something about these black folks in Wilmington. This ain't right. For Southern white men are not supposed to be run by black people. We run them. The last black national leader, because if you remember during Reconstruction, there were several black members of Congress. Now, it was never black domination. It was never, you hear that sometimes in old history books. African Americans were in charge of Reconstruction and they were corrupt, and they were never truly in charge. You never saw a black governor, for instance. You never had a black mayor at that time. But we do see several members of Congress and the Senate. By 1898, there's one black member of Congress, and that was George White, a Republican from North Carolina. He's going to be the last for several decades. He's going to get voted out in about a year. Anyway, he was so concerned at what he was hearing in Wilmington. Apparently, they sold out. White farmers and white business owners were all buying guns because they were told, get ready. They were shipping guns to Wilmington for sell to the white folks, and they were selling out. And so people knew something was up. And so he went to the president, William McKinley, and said, look, you need to do something. You need to send federal troops in or something, because something bad's about to happen to Wilmington. McKinley listened to him, nodded, and said, I'll look into it. And that was it. He never did anything else on this before or after. Finally, November 8th, 1898, they hold elections in North Carolina, including Wilmington. Mostly they're voting for members of the state legislature. There was a lot of violence. To be fair, this image I'm using, this is actually a Reconstruction image, but there was a lot of voter intimidation. There was a lot of violence. A couple of people were killed that day. One of the areas that they were counting votes was a predominantly black area. About 150 armed white men came into the room with these 6 vote counters, took a lot of the votes away, and stuffed the ballot boxes basically with a lot of Democratic votes. It was clearly a problematic election. The results of the election was the Democrats swept the elections, which again, in 19th century terms, what we really mean in the South, at least, that really meant the white vote won over the black vote. Once the results were in, now again, it wasn't for local government, but these armed white men, now we're talking over 300 men with guns, march into City Hall on November 9th, the day after the election, led by Colonel Waddell. And at gunpoint tells the city council, the mayor, other prominent members of the government, including the police officers, and says, it's time to go. Under gunpoint, you are leaving. You are going to officially resign and you're out of here. And so they do, because they want to live. And Waddell is chosen by this armed posse to be the new mayor. And they all pick themselves to run the government. This is a coup d'etat, by the way. Coup d'etat is where an armed group take over a government. This is the first, and as far as we know, the only official coup d'etat ever to happen in America. And it happened in Wilmington, North Carolina. And by the way, the members of the government that they kicked out, somewhere, all the black members were kicked out, but any white member who was a Republican was also kicked out. They were loaded up on trains and sent away, officially to Richmond, and they were told never come back. Some of the black politicians that were loaded up on the trains when they left town, some of the armed men also got on the train and killed some of those black politicians and dumped them off the train. So this is, again, pretty rough. The next day, this armed group, now they're official, by the way, there's already been violence, there's already been murder. Waddell then appoints 250 special policemen, basically this armed group, this lawless group, and makes them basically special policemen. And the first thing they do is they go to the office of the Wilmington Record and they burn it down. A couple people were killed. Manley, by the way, is gone. He knows that they are going after him. He has left it. He will never come back. But they burn down the Daily Record. They stop. They take a photograph. Actually, they take several photographs. And then they go on to terrorize the black community of Wilmington. And hundreds end up leaving Wilmington. There's a lot of debate over exact numbers. Here's another newspaper account of the Daily Record being burnt. I think I had officially 60 killed. Some people think it's much higher than that, but dozens were killed in this, and dozens more, probably hundreds more, were injured. So this, again, is America's first coup d'etat. White supremacists, under the banner of the term Democrat, overthrow what was basically a fair, biracial local government run by Republicans and populists. And again, this is really considered kind of officially, now that Plessy versus Ferguson is out there, they are going to force segregation on. So again, they're doing what kind of happened in Reconstruction in those early days. Remember in 1867, 1868, there was a lot of voter intimidation. We're seeing the same thing again 30 years later. It also showed, because nothing happened, by the way. But this is all over. McKinley knew, the president knew this was going to happen. It happened. It was widely reported across the country. There was national outrage of this. It was reported in other countries. Nothing happened. The federal government did nothing. And that was a sign. That was kind of this is really, I think, the most important part of it. That was the signal to the rest of the white South, whether we're talking Bainbridge, Atlanta, Jacksonville, Tallahassee, where I'm at right now, Quincy, Florida. Every white leader went, oh, we can do this, and nobody will care. Nobody will stop us. Got it. Let's go. There, by the way, again, I'm recording this August 2020. We're having lots of national debates and reckonings about history and why aren't there more markers? And, again, part of this, I'm the first one to admit this is ugly stuff. We don't want to talk about this. And, but there has been attempts to try to talk about this. There was a marker several years ago about Alex Manley and what happened. It was put up in 1999. And then in 2007, it was torn down and nobody bother to put it back up. Just like in Reconstruction, you heard about the Camilla massacre right up the road from Bainbridge, Georgia, and Camilla, Georgia. There was a beginner, late 90s, a historical marker went up in Camilla. It just disappeared. And nobody replaced it, as far as I know. If you know, let me know. And because I've never seen it since. And everyone I talked to said, yeah, we don't know what happened to it. There's also a marker. I don't think I have an image of it. Nope. There's also a marker for this riot, this race riot in Wilmington that just went up last year in 2019. And anyway, but again, this and other scenes like it were reported throughout the country. You know, there are people saying, look what's happening. This was an African-American newspaper in Richmond saying, look, bloody scenes in the South End. And what happens in Wilmington gets repeated over and over and over throughout the South. Wilmington's just the first one. It was the opening wedge. It knocked down the racial door of segregation and said, look, we can, white Southerners, guess what we can do? And no one's going to stop us. The big one, and probably the most famous one, and I'm not sure I don't know if you guys would have learned this in school or not, but this is one that's a little more well known. And that was, sometimes it's known as the Atlanta Race Riot. It's also, I think more recently and more accurately really called the Atlanta Massacre. That's exactly what it was. In September of 1906, we see something very similar happened in Atlanta, which also had the same effect as the Wilmington riots and massacre 10 years earlier. So what's going on in Atlanta? Well, as you probably aware, we talked about this last time, Atlanta was the center of a lot of Black life in America. It still is today. There was a lot of Black success in Atlanta. And there was and again, I want to be careful, not all white Southerners would have been angry about this, but a lot were. There was a lot of white resentment over the success of African Americans. So again, Atlanta in particular, they may not have quite the power that you saw in Wilmington, but there was a large, well-to-do Black middle class. There was Black colleges there. There was Black-owned businesses, Black theaters, and there will continue to be even after this, but nothing like before 1906. Also, this might seem a little weird, but there was also a novel that came out in 1905 called The Klansman, as in the KKK. It was written by a guy named Thomas Dixon. And I mean, this was a bestseller in the United States. And then in 1906, there was several play versions of it that traveled throughout the South. It played in Savannah when it premiered. Because, by the way, what The Klansman is it's a retelling, a fictional, and it's clearly fictional retelling of Reconstruction. And it is all about how African Americans got power. They got in power. They raped white women. They beat up white men. They took over everything. It was chaos. It was awful. But the heroes of the day was the KKK. The KKK got together and they saved the day. And really, the Klansmen created this myth, and it is a myth. And it's a myth I've had students repeat to me. They say, oh, I heard that the Klan was really good people and they came in and saved the day. You know, this is the beginning of that myth. And in a moment, you're going to see it in a history book. Anyway, so the novel came out as a bestseller. It became a play. In 1915, it became the movie Birth of a Nation, but I'll come back to that in a moment. This is a quote by Thomas Dixon. The answer of the Anglo-Saxon race to Negro lips that dare pollute with the words the womanhood of the South is the KKK. You know, in other words, this is going back to Rebecca Felton. This is the duty of white men to protect our white women from those Black brute rapists. And that's very much the story here. So when this play would perform in a town like Savannah, often after audiences, which of course were almost entirely white, would then, after the play, they would often go out and start looting. They would start rioting in the Black communities. And that's what happens partly in Atlanta. This play was performing right before the riot. And by the way, I should have had this up a second ago, but here's some of the images from the novel version. Again, you see, you know, this showing of these noble KKK members. By the way, I do the Scotland program every year. And what's interesting, the term Anglo-Saxon was another term for white. And it's Germanic peoples that move to England. So they become English people. In fact, that's what England means, Anglo land. And here, if you can see it, it says the fiery cross of old Scotland hills. Actually, the Scottish people are not Anglo-Saxons; they're Celtic. So even there, he doesn't get his history right. Anyway, so we see this reaction to the play, but also we're seeing this accusations of rape of 4 separate white women. And again, the accusations against black men. The reason I'm using the term accusations, two men actually ultimately were indicted. They may have been guilty, but we know that probably 1 or 2 of them was consensual, and there's some evidence to point towards these were consensual relationships. So that was there. And again, as you saw, number 4 was there was also political shenanigans going on because this is a gubernatorial election in 1906. And the 2 main candidates, both Democrat because they're white, Hoke Smith, who ran the Atlanta Constitution, and Clark Howell, who ran the Atlanta Journal. And of course, today, those 2 newspapers have joined together. So not only are they running for governor, but they are also competing in the media. It's like CNN and Fox News, basically. So they're both trying to outdo the other one. And they're using race and imagery from the Klansmen and these stories of white women being raped and ravaged to promote themselves, but they were also hoping to promote white supremacy. So you see 2 assaults, now it's 3 assaults. They're whipping up white anger. And ultimately on September 22nd, it spilled over. And this is a detail from a drawing from a French newspaper that reported on this. This riot, and again, like Wilmington, the exact numbers we're not sure. I think official numbers are officially 25 African-Americans were killed. Most historians that have studied this think it's well over 100 African-Americans were killed. But it's basically the second burning of Atlanta, and the Black community was almost completely destroyed at that point. So what were the results of the Atlanta massacre in September of 1906? Again, destroyed Black neighborhoods and businesses. Dozens, at least, of African Americans were killed in this. Hoke Smith, who was one of the loudest voices in this and was in his newspaper absolutely promoted this, becomes governor. He's elected governor. He later becomes U.S. Senator. And once Hoke Smith becomes governor, he officially statewide implements segregation. It was already happening in Georgia at the local level, but this makes it official. So this has the exact same effect that Wilmington had on North Carolina. This has on Georgia now. So Hoke Smith, who again promoted this riot, this massacre, and took part in it, he said at one point in the newspaper, referring to African Americans and African Americans who were behaving badly in his mind, we could handle them just as they did in Wilmington. And one thing I want to mention just for a moment, today in 2020, very often, politicians, whenever there's a riot, or sometimes not even a riot, sometimes it's just a march, but people call it a riot. Sometimes the term thugs, a bunch of thugs out there today, a bunch of thugs and hoodlums. And it's almost become kind of code word for people of color today. If it's all whites, they rarely refer to it as thugs. I just want to point out that it is interesting that in the early 20th century, 1898, really all the way up until the 50s, it was actually quite common for mobs to go into Black communities and destroy it, tear out the businesses, beat up and even kill people. The most infamous was in 1923 in Florida. An entire town, the town of Rosewood, was literally wiped off the map. It was a Black town that was completely wiped off. In other words, these thugs and hoodlums in 1906, for instance, would have been white rioters. Okay, so we talked about Reconstruction on one of the very first lectures, the federal government trying to instill some sense of rights, some sense of equality. In 1915, Woodrow Wilson is president. He was born in Georgia. He was raised in Georgia, later Tennessee, eventually moves to New Jersey, becomes a historian, later becomes governor of New Jersey, and then later president of the United States. When he becomes president, he officially segregates the federal government, which really means whites only are in the federal government. So even the federal government itself is now segregated. So that you can see how far America has reversed itself from the days of Reconstruction. But again, is it really equal? It's separate, but was it equal? And of course, the answer is no. And this is probably the most famous image when we think of segregation, the separate water fountains or the separate bathrooms. And as I said last time, as a kid, I thought, oh, this is rude. You shouldn't do this. But at the same time, I thought, well, it's not that bad. I mean, it's bad, but oh, is it really all that horrible? As we're going to see for the rest of today's lecture, yeah, no, it was, if it really was just this, it really wouldn't have been that big of a deal. This is nothing. This is just sort of the outward sign of segregation. It's not the real issue here, of course, is power. Who makes the decisions? Who has the real power here? And again, as I said earlier, schools, if they existed for African Americans, were almost never funded at the same level as white schools. Not that schools in the South were great anyway at that time. We were poor. But very few qualified teachers would teach in the Black schools. You know, and of course that just perpetuates it. You have a generation that isn't as well educated as they should be, so they're not educating their kids in the same way, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. Even though we're always going to see a Black middle class, we're always going to see Black scientists and Black lawyers and Black politicians. But that group is going to get smaller. It should be expanding over time, and instead that group gets smaller and smaller and smaller because of segregation. Another form of reversal. Again, we have Reconstruction, which gives equality to all citizens. Now we're seeing it reverse. We're seeing it reversed through elections. We're seeing it reversed by the Supreme Court and through laws, but we're seeing it reversed in other ways as well. One of these systems is sharecropping. Sharecropping develops in Reconstruction. In fact, it was a federal government idea initially. And on the surface, sharecropping sounds okay. It sounded like it would be a good idea. So imagine this. You are a former Confederate soldier coming back home in Georgia, or you're a former slave and you have nowhere to live. And both of you need jobs, whether you're white, black, you're poor, you need a job. And so you may not can afford to buy land and have your own house, but you could go to a plantation, which used to have slaves. Now they don't have slaves anymore. You could work on that plantation, and the plantation could let you live on their land, maybe let you have a cabin, probably a former slave cabin. And you would work maybe 40 acres. And at the end of the year, you would share the crop. The planter might get 60% of the crop, and you would get 40%, and you would share you would sell your crop, make some money. And again, on the surface, that's a fine plan, and it could work. And sometimes it did work, but that's not how it usually played out. It did affect, by the way, both poor Blacks and whites. But it was a system that was used as a way to control African Americans, without a doubt. So let me tell you how it really worked. So again, let's imagine you are a poor African American that needs a job, and you need a place to live. And maybe you already have a family, you have a wife, you have kids. So you go to a plantation, you say, look, I need a job. Plantation says, great, I need workers because I lost my slaves. So he gives you a cabin, a former slave cabin, but of course you need a mule, you need a horse, you need a plow, you need seeds to grow, you need clothing for your kids, you need food to live on, because it takes a year to get these crops ready, and you're going to be growing cotton, and you got to sell the cotton. So what the landowner goes, great, I'll let you borrow a mule, I'll let you have some tools. Hey, go down to the local store, go get your kids some food, go get some clothes for them. Put it on my account. Now, by the way, some of these plantations had their own store on the plantation. So literally it was the owner doing this. Like, here's my tools, here's my food. Okay, so let's say that you get to the end of the years, end of the harvest season, and let's say you got some good crops, which, as you guys know, growing up in farm country, that's not guaranteed, but let's just say it's a good year. So now the owner comes and says, okay, I need my cut of your crops. I get 60% or 70% or 50%, whatever the deal was. And so you say, okay, and you sell your crops. Maybe you make $300. I'm making these numbers up. Now, of course, the owner has his little, account book, and he's going to go through and go, okay, so I loaned you a horse, and I loaned you some food, and I gave you some clothing for your kids. So you owe me $330. Oh, wait a minute, you only made $300. You still owe me $30, don't you? Well, guess what? We'll just do another year. Oh, you need food for your kids now because I just took all your money. Oh, you need clothing for your kids because I just took all your money. You still need the horse. You still need seed to grow. Okay, we'll just do it again. And next year you can pay me off. And of course, what happens the next year is you're further in debt and you're further in debt. What happens is you ultimately get tied to the land. You're not a slave. But boy, it sure does look a lot like slavery now. And again, we do see whites and blacks both being, my family, if I go back far enough in the 20s and 30s in Arkansas and Dixie County, Florida, a lot of my family were sharecroppers. But it was much, much worse for African Americans because they really, they already didn't have any rights to vote. They didn't have rights under the law at this point. So this is a way of kind of implementing the benefits of slavery for the landowners. They get free labor, basically, but without actually doing slavery. So it's a harsh system to begin with. But you might think, well, why didn't they just leave? And by the way, I'm going to show a couple of images here of sharecropping shacks. Many of these are former slave shacks. And of course, in Southwest Georgia, where I'm teaching and where you guys live, there's actually still a lot of sharecropping shacks all over Southwest Georgia. So, and I try to use local images. This is one from Thomas County in 1895 of sharecroppers. So let's say, you're in debt. And of course, today people are in debt. They can say, well, I'm just going to leave. In fact, I have an aunt that does that. Every time she'll send us an email or give us a phone call. Hey, I live now in this town. Why? Oh, because we got in a little bit of debt. So we just left. And, people do this, right? Well, back in this time period, being in debt was a legal status. You were known as a peon, P-E-O-N, a peon. So to be a peonage, to be in debt to somebody else, you couldn't run out on that debt. You could get thrown in prison if you ran out on the debt. So but let me back up real quick. Before we get to peonage, maybe you weren't even in debt. Maybe you said, I'm going to leave. This sucks. I'm going to go up to Chicago. And you went to the train station. Guess what? A lot of times the local white community, the landowners, the sheriff would stop you from getting on the train. Where do you think you're going? As much as white Southerners back then used to talk about how awful African Americans were and they're brute rapists and blah, blah, they're savages, you would think, well, why don't they just kick them out? Well, they didn't want to kick them out. They wanted them because they were free labor. They were cheap labor. They were of lower status that made everybody else feel good about themselves. So a lot of people couldn't leave even if they wanted to. And of course, I'm going to leave to Chicago. Where am I going to go? I don't have a job. I don't have a place to live. I don't have any money. That's not necessarily an option for most of these people anyway. But let's say you are in debt and you decide to run off. You could be arrested for that. There also were a whole series of laws known as vagrancy laws. Vagrancy laws it was basically legal to be walking around without any money or a job. So let's say you were in Cairo and you were walking to Donaldsonville and you're walking through Bainbridge to get to Donaldsonville. You're a young African-American. You're going to visit your uncle in Donaldsonville. And you go through Bainbridge and the local sheriff says, hey, who are you? I don't know who you are. And, my name's John. Okay, John. Well, do you have any money on you? Do you have a job? No. I live in Cairo and I'm going to Donaldsonville. Sorry, as far as we're concerned, you're a vagrant. You're going to jail now. Okay. So let's say the next day you go to jail for one day, and the next day your uncle comes from Donaldsonville and says, hey, look, that's just my nephew. Come on. So the sheriff goes, oh, okay, sorry, I shouldn't have arrested him. I'm sorry about that. But he did spend the night in our jail. And by the way, this happened to anybody who went to jail back then. He owes us rent for one night in jail. We fed him dinner and breakfast. He owes us for that. Plus, we had to write him up. We indicted him. He owes us for those documents. He has to pay for that. Oh, he can't pay for that because he doesn't have any money. Well, in that case, he's a peon to the city of Bainbridge or to Decatur. And I'm picking on Bainbridge because that's where we are. This would have happened all over Georgia and Florida and Alabama, not just in Bainbridge. But now you're a peon. You got to work off that debt. So even if you're innocent, even if you're not in debt to a landowner as a sharecropper, now you might just be in debt just to the local sheriff, to the local courthouse, and you have to work off that debt. This happened all the time. You can go to any courthouse, look at their conviction records, and you will see this. And almost in every case, it was people arrested for vagrancy and peonage were almost always Black, and male and young, because they could be worked. So again, you're not allowed to sell people. That's slavery. You can't do that. But what the government would do, what the state and local governments would do, is they would have these convicts, and that needed to work off their debt. They could sell not the person, but they could sell the lease. They could sell the conviction. So they could lease out these people to various landowners or businesses, and they would sell they would lease them out basically on slave markets. And of course they said, we're not selling people, we're selling their conviction, we're selling their debt. I mentioned Andrew Carnegie in the Gilded Age lecture, the richest man in the world. He made a lot of his money in mines in Alabama, and guess who were his workers? Convict lease labor. So again, whether you actually were in debt or you were arrested for a trumped up charge, you could be a convict lease labor. This happened, again, this system started in Tennessee, but the main area, the heart of this system was Southwest Georgia, North Florida, Southeast Alabama, right where most of us are from in this school. And it's something that very few people are aware of. Even back then, very few people were actually aware that this was happening. The main industry they were usually used for was turpentining, which is a really harsh, rough business that very few people wanted to do. So they would be kept like prisoners because they were guilty of crimes. They would be, hauling turpentine and naval stores, timber. They were guarded because, again, they were dangerous people. So they had convict gang guards, which were very similar to slave overseers. Again, as I said, most of these people were very, very young that were this. Eventually the system was overthrown in the 1920s. There was a major expose about this. And so in the 1920s, it eventually went away. And this is some of the photographs in that expose. So these are some of your typical convicts. I mean, these are kids. And I mean, sometimes I call college students kids because I'm old, but I mean, these are literally kids. I mean, look at the one on the lower right. I mean, these kids look like they can't even shave at this point. I mean, they are literally kids. And think about how this must have felt to these kids. Most of these kids, would have been arrested for vagrancy, for instance. Think about what they must think about Georgia, what they think about the government of Georgia, what they think about of America, what they think about of the law. If they get out of this, and many of these people are never going to get out of this, they're going to die through punishment, through harsh conditions, through bad health. But if they do get out, because remember, these guys would be in there for years. For $3, they would be in there for years. Think about how they must have felt, the anger, the sense of hopelessness they would have had, Anyway, but let's say you get, by the way, I'm a big blues music fan. And in the middle, the guy with the guitar was a famous blues singer, famous later, named Skip James. He was a convict lease employee until it went away in the 1920s. And again, you can see they were being hauled around and literally in cages to these work sites. And this is, I'm always picking on Thomasville because there's more photos of them around than anywhere else, but these are some of the convict leases in Thomasville. And one thing to keep in mind is, let's imagine you are, just a regular white resident of Cairo or Thomasville, and you're riding down the road in your wagon or later a car, and you see these guys working, and you think, oh my God, these guys, I bet they're all a bunch of rapists or a bunch of murderers. You probably don't even know that they were just arrested for vagrancy or because they owed a couple of bucks to somebody. You literally think these guys are horrible people, so you don't even think to stop this system. But if you were a convict, one of these convicts in the system, and you misbehaved, you disobeyed an order, the punishments would have been things like you see here, somebody being tied to a pole maybe for 24 hours or longer, or being held down in this position for days, being publicly whipped. By the way, these punishments are identical to the punishments during the time of slavery. As one historian referred to this, who studied this is really unknown to a lot of people till about 30 years ago. It's been almost completely forgotten about. There's one historian named Pete Daniel wrote, basically, it was slavery by another name. And that's absolutely right. And it was kind of hidden in plain sight. Most people didn't even realize this was happening. In the National Archives, there is this letter uh, from a woman named, a teen really, a young woman named Carrie Kinsey, who lived in Bainbridge, Georgia. And she wrote President Teddy Roosevelt saying, can you help me? This is in 1903. Can you help me? My little brother is in prison. He's one of these conflicts. He did nothing wrong. They hold him in chains. Can you do something about it? And Teddy Roosevelt did indeed actually investigate. He sent federal investigators in Georgia, and it turns out there was nothing they could do to stop it. So it continued for another 15 years before it finally went away. So you might be asking yourself, how could this have happened? Why was this allowed? Well, most people know the 13th Amendment as the amendment that freed the slaves. A lot of people don't realize what it actually says. So it says basically neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. The part that's forgotten about is that little part that I have underlined. No slavery nor involuntary servitude, comma, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, comma. This is how they got away with it. This is it. This is how they got to do what they did, was because it was actually in the Constitution. And again, people did speak out about it. There were articles even even as early as 1903. Here is one, again, this is after the Carrie Kinsey letter, that they were going to look into it. Oh my gosh, we didn't know this was happening. We're going to look into this. Nothing stopped it for a long time, though. Okay, so that's one system. So we got voting out. We have segregation is in. We have the convict lease system. We have sharecropping. But another way, once segregation is in place, how does it stay in place? How is it controlled? So we know the law controls it, right? We know the lack of political power also helps to control it. But another way it's controlled, this gets into a little more nebulous area. It's through what we might call popular culture. Again, popular culture, the culture that we all share as Americans. Popular just means people. So today it would be movies and television and the internet and social media and magazines and books and comic books and things like that. Again, the culture that we share as Americans. Late 19th century, early 20th century, it would have been jokes. It would have been books. It would have been newspapers. And again, popular culture does affect us. It can change us. It is a way to control us. What is normal? What is normalized in society? What does everybody just kind of accept as acceptable behavior? So this is a postcard, by the way. And again, I partly began this lecture with talking about human evolution. So this is a joke about evolution. The watermelon into an African American. That's the joke. And I do think humor, of course, I love good humor, but humor is always fascinating because in humor, there's always somebody that is making fun of somebody else, and sometimes I think humor can be quite interesting historically. Who is being made fun of? Who is doing the making fun? And again, the group here, the group that's already oppressed, humor is constantly being used to keep them oppressed, So let me go to the next slide. This is basically restating what I've said, but I want you to think about, let's imagine everyone listening to this, let's just imagine you were born in 1900. Actually, since we're in Georgia, let's say you were born in 1906. So segregation is in place. And whether you're white or black, male, female, doesn't matter. Think about what would you have heard growing up in 1906 all the way up until the 1960s? What would you have heard? What would you have learned in school? What would you have seen in theater, in movies, in cartoons? That's what I want to talk about. Because what we see every single day, whether we know it or not, affects us. Popular culture, movies, first off, it is like a mirror that reflects who we are. It's not a perfect mirror, but it does reflect who we are. That's why when you go see a movie that's an old, I love old movies, sometimes they don't quite work. The humor is not quite as funny, it's not scary, because it was made for a different audience. Or that's why sometimes, and again, I like foreign films, but sometimes foreign films don't quite work. Because again, the audience they made that film for isn't us. So movies today reflect us. That's why it's always funny when I hear people, especially older people, go, I'm tired of all that nudity and dirty language in movies. They need to quit doing that. I'm like, well, quit going to see those movies, because they're just giving you what you want. But in addition to reflecting us, which is why, by the way, this is why historians like old movies and stuff, because we can't understand necessarily what people thought unless they wrote it down. But we can look at the music and movies and go, oh, this is reflecting the attitudes of the day. But at the same time, movies and music and TV and all that, it also affects us. Even whether you know it or not, it kind of affects what you think is normal. You know, most of us has never been to the Middle East. I never have been. So my image of the Middle East is a movie. It's what I see on the news. It's what I read in the newspapers. So popular culture was a form of control. It wasn't always on purpose. Although Josephus Daniels in Wilmington, he actually hired a cartoonist to purposely draw racial cartoons. In fact, some of the cartoons I used in the Reconstruction lecture were actually done by that cartoonist. But most of the time, this stuff just kind of happened, and it just perpetuated itself. So one example of this is the creation of the idea of the Old South. This is a fictional version of the South. The Klansman by Thomas Dixon reflected a fictional version of the Old South. Gone with the Wind is a phony version of the Old South. This is the idea that the South was a place of chivalry, of white knights almost, you know, plantation owners that were like chivalrous knights, gentle women in their little Southern belle dresses with their little fans, and happy slaves that were happy to be slaves singing in the fields. That's the image of the Old South. And again, the best example of it is the film Gone with the Wind from 1939. On the left here, I have what's called sheet music. Before music was recorded, people would write music and then they would sell the sheet music so people at home could play on their piano or guitar or something. And again, most of these, what's interesting, most of this early music, I mean, this is the early pop music of their day, were almost always written by immigrants from Germany, immigrants from Poland and Russia, often Jewish Americans. Most of these were written in New York City. These are people who had never been in the South. They weren't born in America. So what are they doing? They're looking at newspapers and going, oh, this is how Southern people behave. I'm going to write a song about it. So they're reflecting the racial attitudes of the day. But at the same time, they are perpetuating those same racial attitudes. So here you got Mammy Jennings Jubilee, shake your feet. And in itself, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that image, but it portrays this image of slaves or sharecroppers as just wanting to do nothing but dance and sing, and that's it. And what we see over and over again is in music, later in movies and novels, over and over, this is the only image we'll see of African Americans, these very simplistic people who just want to dance and eat, and that's it. I mentioned, of course, I talked about Wilmington. So for instance, in 1940, if you were in school, this is what you would have learned about segregation. So this is from the official North Carolina history book. And by the way, Georgia, Florida, they all had almost exactly the same language. The United Daughters of the Confederates, the UDC, wrote a lot of these textbooks and gave them out for free to the schools because they wanted a very specific version of history. So in this version, it says, the mass of Negroes became poor. And I love the passive voice. They just became poor citizens. It doesn't say how they became, just they became. It's like, hi, that dead guy over there, he just became dead. We don't know how he just became dead. So mass of Negroes became poor citizens. To keep them voting, carpetbaggers and scalawags allowed them to do very much as they pleased. Crimes went unpunished. The white people of the South were no longer safe. White people all over the South joined together in a sort of, that's a typo there, but a sort of club they named the Ku Klux Klan. Dressed as goats, they scared lawless men into acting decent. That's all. They just scared them. Boo. Oh, yep, that's all we did. And we know very much that this is not the case. A lot of that at the end, that last little bit about dressing as ghosts, that actually comes from the movie Birth of a Nation, which was based on the novel The Klansman. So that literally comes directly out of a movie. And then it goes into, somebody watched the movie and went, oh, that's what they did. And no. So this is a perfect example of how popular culture literally affected history. And then that history was perpetuated onto school children. And again, a lot of white folks in the South, they literally, legitimately believe this was true. Oh, I read it in the textbook. It must be true. My teacher told me this, which is why even today, when you bring this up, people are like, that didn't happen, because this is what they were taught. So I'm going to go through a couple of images from popular culture. This image in itself isn't necessarily ugly. You know, I only use it because it's Decatur County, 1905, but it was a postcard. It was meant to be a joke. So you have an overweight African-American male, and he's got a big, you know, he weighs 300 pounds, and he's about to carve up a watermelon that weighs 150 pounds. You know, I mean, that's the joke. It's a joke. It's a big guy eating a big watermelon, right? But again, going back to what I said a second ago, this is kind of the typical image of African Americans. Simple, smiling, doesn't have a care in the world. All this guy wants, he doesn't want to be president. He doesn't want to vote. He just wants some watermelon. That's it. And it's that image over and over again. Happy African Americans that don't care about anything, but just doing their simple jobs and eating their food, and that's it. And again, I think so many Americans really believed, like, they didn't even think like, oh, African Americans don't want to vote. Look, every time I see an African American, they're just smiling and happy. They don't want to vote. So again, these ideas of popular culture just continue to perpetuate itself. It's interesting, again, this 2020, just this year, they decided to finally rename Aunt Jemima pancakes. So these pancakes, and I may still have them in my closet. I have bought this brand before. Aunt Jemima pancakes were invented in the 1890s. It was a Gilded Age invention. Sorry, I'm going to have to. That's always a bad sign. It means I'm talking too long. My voice is getting, my throat's getting dry. Sorry. Anyway, so Aunt Jemima pancakes were really easy to make, right? You just mix water and you mix them up and you cook them up. So you might ask, why do they call them Aunt Jemima pancakes? Why that image? And the model was based on that they hired a Black woman who they painted, and then they had to travel around showing how easy pancakes were made. So you think, why do they call it Aunt Jemima? And you know, sometimes when I ask students, they'll say, well, because Black women are really good cooks, or Southerners are good. And sure, that's true. But the reason they picked, they could have just said Jemima. Why Aunt Jemima? And even that term, not that many women in 1890s were named Jemima. I mean, that has kind of an old school feel to it. I'll tell you why, and it's very specific. It's supposed to evoke slavery. The term aunt or uncle, as in Uncle Ben's rights, which is also just got renamed. These were terms for slaves that worked in the house, that worked in the kitchen, or as butlers or servants. They often were referred to by the terms aunt and uncle. That was a term of endearment, but always first name, never last name. So the Aunt Jemima with the bandana, you know, the quote unquote do-rag on her head, the fact that she is cooking for you. What this is saying is these pancakes are so easy that it's like having a slave. That's how easy these pancakes are. That was why they picked it. And today, most people don't pick up on that unless you tell them that. But in 1890s, people were still alive who owned slaves. They were like, oh, I get it. I get why you named it that. I get it. It was very common to look at magazines and see ads like this one. This was an ad for makeup for people who performed in blackface. And I'm not going to read it, but you can see, you know, the casual use of the N-word, for instance. This is a postcard for a chain of chicken restaurants, Coon Chicken Inn. And here you have the bellboy, the servant, obviously African-American, but this monstrous version of African, purple skin, big, giant, monstrous looking black lips. But what's interesting to me is look at where it's from. Salt Lake City, Utah, Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon. Even today in 2020, these are not places with large populations of African Americans. And in the early 20th century, very, very few. So imagine if you live in, say, Salt Lake City, Utah. And again, Utah is still pretty white to this day. There's a very good chance you have never seen a Black person. What is your image of Black people? Aunt Jemima pancakes, Coon Chicken Inn, those people I saw in Birth of a Nation, those people I read in The Klansman. This is going to affect how you would have thought, even not being in the South if you were white. And then somebody might say, oh yeah, they don't have the vote. They don't want the vote. Why would we give those people the vote? So again, you can see how these things can keep being perpetuated over time. And again, if you've been in any antique stores, you will see, you know, items where it's literally jet black skin, you know, these things that don't quite look human. Uncle Remus is really an interesting one. Uncle Remus tales were real folk tales that go all the way back to Africa, that were brought over by enslaved Africans. Stories of Brer Rabbit and Brer Bear. But during Reconstruction, a writer named Joel Chandler Harris, who grew up on a plantation, by the way, and supported slavery, he used to write very much against Reconstruction and against Black equality. And he made up a character called Uncle Remus. And that was kind of his made-up guy. Oh, I was talking to this guy named Uncle Remus. Uncle Remus liked slavery. He said slavery wasn't that bad. But every so often, he would, in the newspaper, he would have Uncle Remus tell a story. And it would be one of these actual folk tales that he had learned as a child listening to slaves. And so eventually people said, those tales are pretty cool. So he wrote a book, Uncle Remus Tales. And they are really cool because, again, they are part of American literature. The tales themselves, they are part of Black literature as part of just American at all. And of course, some of you may know the movie Song of the South, the Disney film that you can't find today. If you've ever been to Splash Mountain at Disney World, that's based on Song of the South. The song Zippity Doo Dah, Zippity Yay, My Oh My, What a Wonderful Day. That was an Oscar-winning song from Song of the South, sung by, quote unquote, Uncle Remus. Uncle Remus is the problem. The reason why you don't see that movie anymore is because Uncle Remus is the problem. He is a made-up apology for slavery. The stories themselves, however, are great. In fact, there are versions of those tales that they just take Uncle Remus out because, again, he was the made-up part. And again, I go back to humor all the time. This is another postcard. Two blacks don't make a white. And this is going back to if you have any African background, you are going to be Black no matter what. You can only be white if everybody in your family is white. If anybody is Black, then you're Black. And that's what this is basically kind of making a joke about. Again, going back to the music, the casual use of racial language. Again, look who wrote this, Saul Bloom. That's a Jewish American name. This is more than likely a new immigrant in New York who's probably never came to the South. He's just reflecting what he's hearing other people say. I purposely left the title up there. It says, I'm from Florida. This is actually from the Tampa newspaper. This is just a performance show, the minstrel show, where, white performers would have been performing in blackface and, all new, all white in the flesh. But of course, they're going to be in blackface. Children's books using, racial imagery, terms like Sambo. If you want a nice dark tan, come and join us. Again, get the joke. They're Black. You're going to get in the water. You're going to get Black. So that's how you get a tan, right? This phrase, which I'm not going to say, obviously, but this is a phrase that basically refers to the idea of having African Americans in your family history. So this is, again, the casual use. This is a greeting card you would just send to somebody. And that's what always shocks me looking back is again, how casual this was. This is the paper in Bainbridge, the Post Searchlight. So this is, I forgot the exact year, this is early 1900s. And if I do a close-up on this, where you can actually see it, it says, the Bolsheviks, and that's basically referring to communists and socialists, which were getting quite popular in the 19-teens. So it says, the Bolsheviks have invaded the Negroes around Atlanta. And we would like to see one of that gang talking to a bunch of Decatur, and you can finish it yourself. But yeah, just again, the casual use of the N-word in an official newspaper. Is quite, and again, what's interesting to me is they use Negro, which just simply means Black, in the first sentence, but then for the African Americans in the local community, they use the N-word. And by the way, the N-word was always considered rude. It was never a nice word. I have heard people say, "Oh, one time that was an okay word." Now it was never considered okay. It was always seen as an insult from the very beginning. So that was not an accident that they used that word. And we can still see the physical aspects of segregation still with us today. This is the Leaf Theater in Quincy, Florida. This is just a couple of blocks from my house. It's a musical theater today. It used to be a movie theater built in the 1940s. What this was the Black entrance. Today it's a fire exit. But what would happen was you would go to this movie theater and you would buy tickets. And then if you were Black, you had to go outside, even if it was raining, go up the stairs to the balcony. Now, I know some of you go, hey, the balcony is the cool part. But remember, this is pre-air conditioning. So, heat rises. So have you ever been in your attic in the summer? That's what a balcony would feel like pre-air conditioning. So that was the most hottest, most dreadful part of the theater was that's why African Americans were sent up top. Well, the white Americans got to sit down low where it would be a lot cooler and they could see better. And I may put a link to one of these throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s. You would see a lot of cartoons that would be very stereotypical. And if you watch some of these, I mean, they're clearly racist, but they're not, in some ways, they may not be as offensive as you might think they would be. And in fact, I had a student one time say, well, there's Yosemite Sam and Elmer Fudd. Those are dumb-looking white people. And they were absolutely right to point that out. But again, here's the problem. As I said earlier, the only images you would see of African Americans in cartoons, in movies, and plays was always this very racial, stereotypical, simplistic image. Yes, you would see Yosemite Sam, who's a Texan, dumb Texan with guns, but you would also see doctors and white lawyers and white heroes. You would never see black heroes, black doctors, black lawyers. That's really more the problem, the lack of positive images. Some of you may recognize who this person is. This is a white actress in blackface in a movie in the 1930s, which a lot of actors and actresses would have done that in the 30s. It was considered normal. And again, I might make sure, if I remember, I'll try to put a clip of her actually performing in blackface. But the person is actually Judy Garland, who many of you may still know as being Dorothy in the original Wizard of Oz. But speaking of movies, the first major film in America is one I've mentioned a couple of times, Birth of a Nation. I go into a little more detail in the new immigration lecture. This is one of the reasons why the Klan comes back. It was based on Thomas Dixon's The Klansman. It was a massive hit in 1915. It played in Bainbridge. It played in Tallahassee. In fact, when it played in Bainbridge, it was a huge production. They had a full symphony in Bainbridge. They had actors that performed in front of the movie. It was advertised. It wasn't even Townsville. Bainbridge got it. And it was advertised all over southwestern Georgia. Come to Bainbridge to watch Birth of a Nation. And again, it gave this very poor, false history of what Reconstruction was really like. Again, speaking of that, I mentioned a student that said, well, hey, isn't Yosemite Sam a white stereotype? Yeah, sure. This is a good example of what I meant by the lack of positive imagery. So here is a cartoon where even in the same cartoon, you have a white person drawn normal, but the African-American is drawn in this monstrous way. And this was, I think, from 1915. And the white guy is saying, say, Sambo, don't you think this piece of watermelon is rather large? And then, of course, the servant, again, notice who's the servant, who's the boss. And he says, golly, boss, that ain't half big enough. Again, the joke itself isn't really that funny or that offensive, but it's the language, the fact that he's just smiling, all he cares about is a watermelon, he doesn't speak good English. Again, it's just perpetuating constant stereotypes. Then we get a little bit into some darker humor. When I was a kid, my grandfather, who grew up in Arkansas, then moved to Florida, he used to call me Gator Bait. And he lives in Ocala, Florida, near Gainesville, near Florida Gators. So I always thought that was just a joke. Hey, Gator Bait, come here. When I became a historian, I learned about these postcards. There were hundreds of these. In fact, I have one that when I teach in person, I actually bring to class. And I bought that years ago at an antique store. And I showed it to my grandfather. And he said, oh, yeah, that's where I got your nickname from. He said these postcards were everywhere. From the early 1900s all the way up until the 1960s, you could find these postcards in gas stations and drugstores and bookstores, newsstands. So what is it? So basically, the joke is, and I'm joking quotes, is if you want to catch an alligator, you need some chum. You need some bait. So these African-American children, that'll be your bait. That'll be your gator bait. And again, what's really, by the way, this, I do need to say this, it never actually, this is not a real thing. It is supposed to be, quote unquote, a joke. I did have somebody ask me that they never actually did this. But what's interesting and really disturbing is they're not stereotypes. In fact, they're actually real photographs that they just kind of traced to make a cartoon. When you talk about the killing of a baby, it's not a cartoon, it's real babies. That's what makes it even more disturbing, is that and again, to me, this is so revealing. And one thing I do want to say, this is obviously not you and I. I mean, this is another world. I don't recognize this world in many ways. But can you imagine a society that would think, and I like my dark humor. I like black humor, you know, as far as like, you know, but, and what I mean by black humor, that's probably a bad phrase to say at this point, but I mean dark humor. I do enjoy, you know, but I can't imagine how any group of people could go, oh yeah, let's talk about killing a black child. Oh, that's funny. Maybe Hitler, maybe that would be funny. But other than that, I don't know why this would be funny. Now, the postcards never took it to the next step, if you will. But when I was an archivist with the Florida State Archives, one of my last couple of months there, I discovered this postcard, free lunch in the Everglades in Florida. Now, this wasn't a baby, it was a man. But again, it's a realistic version of a person clearly in agony, getting bit and about to be eaten by an alligator. And this is a postcard that you just mail to somebody. Hey, look at this. Somebody's getting eaten by an alligator. Isn't that great? The gator bait postcard that I have, it actually was a postcard sent in 1906 from a woman in Pennsylvania, and she's sending it to somebody in New York. They're not even Southern. And again, the casualness of this. And so again, if you saw this every day, day out, images like this, in, you know, stereotypes, it would begin to affect who you are. If you were white, you would say, this is what African Americans are like. If you're African American, you start going, well, I'm never going to be president. I'm never going to own stuff. I'll just, and you start giving up. And this is how these ideas can stay around for generations. This young guy is actually from Africa. He was from an area known as the Belgium Congo, which is in the center of sub-Saharan Africa today. It's today the Democratic Republic of Congo. He was in his early 20s. He was not an immigrant in the way we think of him, though. He was actually captured in the Belgian Congo. Congo was owned by the country of Belgium, and they had basically brought back slavery. He was basically purchased and brought to the United States. He was what they called a pygmy, which was an actual group. He was very short, it's 4'11". And it was a group of an African ethnic group who tended to be a lot smaller than many other peoples. And he was actually brought over to be in the zoo in New York City, in the Bronx, which was at that time the premier zoo in the country. It was run by a scientist named William Hornaday. Some of the most prominent Americans like Teddy Roosevelt, William McKinley, and others helps fund the zoo initially. They helped start the zoo. Almost every major scientist was a member of that zoological society. And in 1906, Oda Benga was brought in and literally caged in the zoo in what was known as the monkey house, where the apes and monkeys would be. So you would see gorillas, you would see chimpanzees. Oh, there's a person, an African. In fact, he was housed specifically with orangutans. Now at night, they had a little room he could sleep in, but during the day, he had to stand out there. They gave him a little bow and arrow. As you saw in this first image, they kind of dressed him up in this simplistic way. They used to put bones on the bottom of the cage to imply that he's a cannibal. The zoo even said, we rescued him from the cannibals in the Congo, which isn't true. It was, I must admit, though, it was highly controversial. I mean, a lot of people, thousands of people went to see him. But there were also a lot of people, white and black, who also were appalled at this. The NAACP spoke out against it. Many other people spoke out. Eventually, the zoo did let him go. And a couple of years later, he committed suicide in New York City. And it's one of the most tragic stories. And to me, it's emblematic of this time period. And this is not even happening in the Jim Crow South. This is happening in New York City, which was the progressive area. This was the area that's supposed to be beyond all of this there. And yet, even in New York City, they could do something like this. New York Times, this is their quote. There was a lot of anger about this, so this was from their editorial. The editorial was called "Send Them Back to the Woods." And it says, "We do not quite understand all the emotion which others are expressing in this matter. Pygmies are low on the human scale." In other words, who cares? It's just a pygmy. A biologist from Harvard University, he was actually passed on by this point, but he was quoted by a lot of people. He was a premier biologist, and he was very clear. Africans were a separate species. They were a degenerate race. And people repeated this, saying, oh, this isn't too bad. Come on, this author Benga, he's no more than an ape, basically. Remember what I said in part 1. This is the racial science of the day, the ideological background that justified all of this behavior. And so again, this young man who could have been a scientist, perhaps, he could have been a novelist, could have been a poet, was literally kept in a zoo, and then he committed suicide. Now, I know already you're like, oh my God, can it get any more negative? And sadly, the answer is yes, it will get more negative. But I do need to point out that there were plenty of African Americans that were trying to rebel as much as they could. And one of the ways they were rebelling was through trying to have counter images. So even though mainstream Hollywood were aimed at white audiences, theaters were either segregated. A lot of cases, they were white only. There were indeed, in Black neighborhoods, there were Black movie theaters. And there were Black movie studios. My hometown of Jacksonville, Florida, actually was home to the biggest of these, Norman Film Company. Unfortunately, they are long gone, and only one of their movies survives. And only one person owns it, and he charges $500 for a copy of it. So I've only seen very short clips from it, sadly, but the movie posters still survive. And again, looking at what you see here, you see a Western, you see what's clearly a World War I picture. Bill Pickett was their big star. He was a rodeo star that starred in several Westerns. You can see a vast difference from what we've already seen, right? I mean, even though you see what's clearly a couple people are supposed to be funny, others supposed to be serious, but these are realistic drawings. These are, just normal depictions. This is the type of image you're not seeing elsewhere in American culture. But of course, these films were only played in a few Black theaters. That's it. And again, they're all gone except for that one movie. When you looked at Hollywood films in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, if you saw African Americans at all, most of the time they were servants, they were slaves, usually in the background. Every so often, there would be an actor. This is Lincoln Perry from Key West, Florida. He played a character called Stepin Fetchit. Get the name? Hey, go Stepin Fetchit, boy. That's what the name's supposed to mean. He was actually a really good actor, and he was well-trained. He did earn a lot of money from what he did, but he earned that money forced to play characters like Stepin Fetchit. If you were going to make it as an actor, you had to play roles like this. And some people today are very critical of Stepin Fetchit. They say you just perpetuated it. Other people said you were doing what you had to do in the time period. You can decide for yourself. Face to face, I usually show a couple of clips of him. If I remember, I'll try to put a clip of Stepin Fetchit so you can hear his voice. There were some responses to civil rights. We mentioned Booker T already. Later, at the end of the semester, we're going to do a whole lecture on civil rights. So if you're taking notes, and I hope you are, you don't need to take notes for the next few slides. I'm going to run through them very quickly. Again, I'm going to repeat this later in the semester, but I did want to make sure I did mention that African Americans did fight back. Booker T was trying to fight back. People like W.E.B. Du Bois, who very much wanted to fight segregation in the courts. The problem was the courts would not listen to his arguments. He wrote a book called Souls of Black Folks, which is his most famous writing. He basically was talking about something that I think many African Americans can identify with. I'm white, so I can just be a guy. I'm a doctor. I'm a historian, right? If I was African American, I'd always be the Black teacher, the Black historian. In other words, you're when you're Black in America, you're two things at once. You're a guy, but you're also the Black guy. And think about it, whenever somebody tells, especially white people, when they tell a story, if it involves a Black person, they always say, oh, I got a friend. Oh, by the way, he's Black, by the way. I just wanted to, or I was at the store and this waiter, he was Black. Anyway, you never let that go. It's always part of who you are. You can't just be a person. You're always a Black. There's like this added baggage that you have. And that's what W.B. Du Bois was writing about way back in the early 20th century. He helped found the NAACP, and what they was arguing for was ending Jim Crow, wanted equal education, really pushing the boundaries, challenging Jim Crow. The problem was, again, the law wasn't on their side. The courts weren't on their side. So this approach is not going to be effective until the 1950s. And we'll get into that much later. But Booker T was, good Lord, excuse me, W.B. Du Bois was trained as a historian. He's the first African-American to get a PhD, but he didn't get it in America. He got it at the University of Berlin, and he trained in sociology and history. He actually wrote the first accurate history of Reconstruction. But he's also a father, and he sent his daughter to college, and he very famously wrote her a letter in 1914, and this is a little quote of it. He says, he's talking about what college is going to be like, and at one point he says, "You will meet, of course, curious little annoyances. People will wonder at your dear brown and your sweet crinkly hair. But that simply has no importance and will soon be forgotten. Remember that most folk laugh at anything unusual, whether it is beautiful, fine, or not. You, however, must not laugh at yourself. You must know that brown is as pretty as white, or prettier, and crinkly hair as straight, even though it is harder to comb. The main thing is the you beneath the clothes and skin." In other words, he's giving that talk that I think many people of color still have to give today in one way or another. Like, when you go to college or when you go to school, you're going to be seen as different from everybody else. You know, and that's he's giving what some people call the talk. And this is the 1914 version of it. Another civil rights activist who was also quite different was Marcus Garvey. By the way, Booker T was, again, half white, half black, going by his biology. His father was a white slave owner. He was born a slave. W.B. Du Bois was born after slavery, and he was only quarter African-American. He had a lot, you know, and I know that's an awkward thing to talk about in 2020, but I think to some degree, their background, their skin tone, to some degree, where they are from, affects their attitude. Marcus Garvey, who talked about this all the time, he said, "I am black. I am. My skin tone is black. I am. You know, I'm not light skinned, or I'm not brown. I am black." He also was an immigrant born in Jamaica. He was not born in this country. And so he's going to kind of have a different approach than both Booker T and W.B. Du Bois, who are coming as native born African Americans. Marcus Garvey comes to America, and he pushed the Back to Africa movement. He said, we need to leave this country and go back to Africa. Of course, he could say that easier because he was not born. By the way, he never actually went to Africa. He ended up, unfortunately, fortunately for him, got involved in a financial scandal, and he died relatively young. But again, I think you could say this is somebody who never felt that this was truly his home. Marcus Garvey, however, that was never a big deal, the Back to Africa movement. What was a big deal, however, was what later becomes known as the Black is Beautiful movement. Both Booker T and W.B. Du Bois talked a lot about being accepted in white America. That's even the letter that Du Bois wrote to his daughter. He's talking like, don't worry about what they say. Eventually they'll accept you, you know. And W.B. Du Bois wanted his daughter to be trained same as white kids were trained. Marcus Garvey, his attitude was, who cares about white culture? The hell with white culture. Black is beautiful. Black matters. Don't worry about what they are doing. Let's do our own thing. And that aspect of Marcus Garvey, I think, did have a big impact. Maybe not quite as radical as what he wanted, but in the 1920s, you do get what used to be called the New Negro movement. Today, it tends to be referred to as a Harlem Renaissance, where you have poets like Langston Hughes and writers like James Weldon Johnson, or anthropologists and novelists like Zora Neale Hurston, the first Black anthropologist in America. People who are celebrating Black culture, jazz artists like Louis Armstrong, or Duke Ellington, or jazz singers like Billie Holiday, who are singing about Black culture. They're creating their own musical styles. They're not the Marcus Garvey. It's not that they don't care about white culture, or they want to go back to Africa, but they are celebrating Blackness. They're not hiding it. They're not trying to pretend that that's not part of who they are. And I think that's the most powerful part of Marcus Garvey. And it's one of the reasons why in the 20s and 30s, despite Jim Crow, we do see Black culture blossom at that point. Another response by African Americans, especially after World War I, is we do begin to see African Americans leave the South. Now, I mentioned earlier that a lot of times they weren't allowed to leave, but after World War I, they did have a little more freedom to leave, and we do see what's known as the Black Exodus or the Black Migration. This is when you start getting neighborhoods like Harlem and New York City and major Black areas of Chicago and Boston and L.A. and places I'm sorry, my mind just went blank. Oakland is what Oakland was the city I was trying to come up with, sorry. But this is when African Americans were beginning to leave the South in large numbers. All right, so let's get back to controls. So another control was the Klan. Now, I will say, I do think the Klan has been a little bit exaggerated over the years. And of course, most white Southerners were not members of the Klan, but the Klan was a reality. It started, of course, in Reconstruction, but it eventually went away. And when Thomas Dixon wrote The Klansman, the Klan really wasn't a thing anymore. In fact, if you listen to the new immigration lecture, you already know this. But the Klan came back in 1915 because of a rape case involving a Jewish American. He didn't do it, but he was assumed to have done it at the time. And at the end of that case, the Leo Frank case, several members of this vigilante group, vigilante means to take the law in your own hands, they met on top of Stone Mountain. There's a reason why Stone Mountain is very controversial today. In fact, I'm recording this on a Monday. Saturday, 2 days earlier, there was a major riot at Stone Mountain between white supremacists and the Black Lives Matter movements really clashed there. It's always been the site of that. And there's a reason why there's a huge Confederate carving on it. I mean, this was always symbol of the old white South. And on top of Stone Mountain, these Knights of Mary Phagan was the young girl who was raped and murdered. It was not by Leo Frank, but he was accused of it. They burnt a cross on top of that mountain. And they basically decided to reform the Klan. The other thing they had just done is they had just watched the movie Birth of a Nation. And they said, well, because they could have come up with their own name, but they said, oh, that movie, remember the Klan was in it? Let's bring that back. And in that movie, the movie kind of made up a lot of the costumes of the Klan. So they imitated that movie. But the Klan was huge from 1915 until the 1930s. And really the height was the mid-1920s. This is the photograph is taken almost right in front of the White House. And this is looking down Pennsylvania Avenue. And you can barely see it, but at the very end of the street, that's the Capitol. And you see two towers on the right. The second one, the one closer to the middle, that was the post office, the federal post office. Today it's Trump. It's the Trump Hotel. If you ever see that in DC, he has a big hotel. That's the Trump Hotel. Just to give you a sense of where this is. This was a major. Good Lord, that was a Freudian slip. I'm sorry. This is a major KKK rally. In Washington, D.C. And again, people are celebrating. Yeah. I mean, the KKK was in the millions in the 20s. That's how popular it was. And they were one of the forms of control. Oh, I just talked about this, why they came back, Leo Frank case. Let me talk about another form of control. I could do a whole lecture on this. This is going to be, I'll try to keep this as short as I can. This is one that, again, historians are only recently really began to look at. It's something known as redlining. It began in the 1930s and lasted, some people argue it still is here, but officially it lasted at least till the 60s. Redlining was this idea that banks, when they gave out house loans, they often would not give house loans to Black Americans. They would literally draw these maps, like here's Savannah, and they would draw these maps and they would say, okay, this is the best area. This is the red area. That's the worst area. And if you look at the notes, not on this, but if you look at the actual notes, they'll say, well, this is mostly Black areas. So we're not going to loan any money to them. Oh, this is the white area. We're going to give a lot of money to them. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, there was a couple of welfare laws that were passed to try to promote home ownership. And they were very clear, whites only. In the late 40s, when suburbs, and you see this here, when suburbs were developed, the federal law basically was whites only. And then they even had it when you bought your home. In the fine print, it basically said, you cannot sell to a Black family. So this is what becomes known as redlining. This is another version of systemic racism. And you might think, okay, that's terrible, but that was 70 years ago. Why does this matter today? Well, it has huge repercussions long term. So think about, here's a couple more red line maps. So think about, to be middle class, if you Google middle class, I did this just today, this is one of the images that will pop up. And notice what's the image? Houses. So if you can buy a house, you own your land. Yes, you have a mortgage, but what can you do with that house? Well, you can take that house and get a second mortgage, which is a loan. And you can afford then to take that second mortgage and send your kid to college, to buy a car. Or if you buy the house, you can then sell that house. In other words, buying a house is a way of getting money. And so you might buy a house for $30,000 in 1948 and sell it in 1968 for $80,000. Not only are you making your money back, you're making more money. And in the meantime, you might have gotten a second mortgage. And, otherwise, you can convert a house into wealth. But if you can't buy a house, say you're a Black family, that means you're paying rent. You're just throwing money away. You can't get a mortgage on that rent. You can't get a loan. You have no equity. That means how much are you worth? You're just throwing your money away. So there were a lot of Black middle-class families in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that by the 60s and 70s are no longer middle class. And yet poor white families who can get a government loan, buy a house, by the time they're middle-aged, now they are middle class. So we see poor Americans becoming middle class through home ownership, but Black Americans going the opposite direction, which is why even today, Black neighborhoods tend to be the poor neighborhoods. Not all, of course, but a lot of our poorer neighborhoods than the white neighborhoods. This is huge, and it's almost never talked about at all. Finally, this is where we are getting to the end here. I know it's more than long enough, and this is the ugliest part of the lecture: lynchings. Now, a lot of controls, as you saw, were things like voting, things like home ownership, but some of the controls were right up front, and they are ugly as they can be. This is a postcard, by the way, of people who were lynched. So what is a lynching? A lynching is a public murder. It's a public ritual. I mean, there's murders like the Wilmington riots. I mean, there were murders that happened. But a lynching is something where the murder happens in the front of the community. Sometimes it would happen in the town square. And it was basically people taking the law into their own hands. Some of the people lynched may very well have been guilty. Still doesn't make it right. It's still murder because we have to go through the system. You have to get a trial. But very often these people were not guilty of what they were accused of. And often it wasn't about that one person. It was often a message to everybody else. And even though we do see people like Leo Frank lynched, who was Jewish American, we even see people lynched for political reasons. Over 95% of all lynchings were of African Americans. And in the South, it was almost entirely African Americans. And they were done to maintain these racial norms. Exact numbers are still, we're still trying to figure out exactly all the lynchings that happened, but what we historians can verify are well over 4,000 African Americans were lynched between the 1880s, again, the end of Reconstruction, until the 1920s. Some areas, like where I'm at in Gadsden County, Florida, had lynchings as late as the 1940s. So this is a New York Times study. Actually, it was a study by historians that New York Times published showing what we can document lynchings. And those little circles are numbers of lynchings. You can see some areas are very dark. And if you look at where Southwest Georgia and North Florida is, it's quite dark. Mississippi, Alabama was a lot worse. But you can see where we are, where ABAC at Bainbridge was a major lynching area. And this, again, is what this is documenting. Areas that had the highest numbers of lynchings, Mississippi #1, but Georgia was #2, and then Texas, Louisiana, and I think Florida was like 5 or 6. Looking at Southwest Georgia, that we can document, in Decatur County, 14 people were lynched, 13 all male, 13 Black, 1 white. Early County, 15 people were lynched, all Black and male. Miller County, 10, all Black. All male, 7 Black, 3 white. Mitchell County, 8. Thomas County, 8. So even where we're at, in sparsely populated Southwest Georgia, if you lived here, you would have seen at least 1 lynching, and you would have heard about dozens of others. Here is again the Democrat, an early paper that later merged with the Post Searchlight in Bainbridge. And if you look up close, more hemp, meaning rope, more hemp needed, attempt of a white lady. Basically, we got to go lynch somebody. And look who wrote it. Deputy Sheriff wrote that. So again, this was something that was done publicly. This is a crowd in 1916 at a lynching. You don't even see the lynching, you just see the crowd. One guy's holding another guy up. When I was a grad student in 2002, I interviewed a guy named George Lacoris. I recorded an interview with him. He, in the 1930s, he was a teenager. He was 18 and 35. He was in something known as the CCC. This was a welfare program to help people who were out of work. And I was interviewing him about that because I wrote my dissertation on that. And we were talking, and he said, "Oh, you live in Quincy." I was in Quincy. And then he made a funny face. And he said, "Oh, you don't want to hear about that." And I said, "Oh, no, tell me about it. You sure?" Like, yeah. I had no idea what he was going to say. And he said that he arrived in 1935 in Quincy, got off the bus in downtown Quincy, Florida. And he saw a huge crowd, kind of like what you see here. And he was kind of excited, like, all right. Because what happened was on the weekends, he was allowed to go off by himself and then went back to work on Monday. So he was really excited. Maybe it was a fair or a carnival. And then he saw blood on the street around the town square. And then he saw in a tree hanging a black man, naked. He was dead by this point. His penis had been cut off and shoved in his mouth. People were running up to him and stabbing the carcass, cutting parts of his fingers off to save as souvenirs. Turns out this man was accused of raping a white woman. I have no idea, by the way. I've tried to look into it, whether he did it or not. And it doesn't really matter at this point. George Lacoris, this guy, by the point he was in his late 70s. He had been a Marine. He had fought in World War II. I got a feeling that he probably wasn't a civil rights activist, if, just based on some things he said privately. But as he was telling this story, he was shaking. He started to cry. I had to turn the tape recorder off because he took him a while to kind of come over it. And I thought, wow. I thought, first off, I leaned over and put my hand on his knee and just said, are you okay? Because I had no idea he was going to tell that story. And my first thought was, when I touched his knee to see if he was okay, I thought, wow, I am 1 degree away from a lynching. I was born in 72. To me, I didn't even know about lynchings until I was in college. This is not a world I recognize at all. And yet, there are still people, there may not be many left. I think George Lacoris, I heard he did pass away recently. But there are still a few people alive who saw lynchings. It's still that close to us. And when I touched his knee 18 years ago, I was 1 degree away from that lynch. A lynching, I'm in Quincy, Florida. If I open up these shades and turn the camera a little bit that way, you can see the top of the Quincy courthouse. This is a town where my son grew up. And there was a lynching just a couple of blocks from here. This lynching that this guy saw. Even right this second, it gives me chills thinking about it. It's anyway. But then the other thought I had was he really was shaking. He cried because he clearly hadn't talked about it in years. And we had turned the tape recorder off. And I thought, this is the guy who didn't even live in Quincy. He saw it, left. Imagine the impact that a lynching would have on a young kid who saw it. And as you saw by those numbers, everybody that grew up in the South would have seen a lynching at least once, or at least heard about it. Black, white, young, old, male, female, doesn't matter. It will keep you from doing things. People say all the time, oh, if I lived back then, I wouldn't have done that. Yeah, you would have. Because it may not have been you that was lynched, but it might be your mother, or more likely your father or your brother, a friend of yours. Let's say you're white and you're, I want to help the black people. No, you're not, because you're going to get lynched. It's going to affect how you think, and it's going to keep you in line. Most of us are never going to get struck by lightning, but when it gets lightning out, we go inside just in case. Most people would not have been lynched, but just in case, you're going to be kept in line. It was that serious of a thing. And I apologize in advance. We're going to look at a couple of images of lynchings here. This is a huge crowd. You can see two kids looking at the camera. This is in St. Louis, Missouri. And you can see in the background an African-American. It looks like he's been burnt, tied to a post. This is from Indiana, by the way. This is not even in the South. Two African-Americans being lynched. What is the most disturbing about this image to me is not the two dead bodies. It's the crowd. If you see a lynching today, which they don't happen, thank God here, but if you see a lynching, somebody's being murdered, and you don't stop it, you don't report it to the police, you are just as guilty of that murder. You're an accessory to that murder. Everyone in this image is part of that murder. Are they hiding their faces? No. They're looking right at the camera. Look, get a picture of me. There's a dead body. I want to be in it. Look at the couple on the left. I have a close-up of them. Oh, sorry. I have a close-up in just a moment. They were holding hands. Here is another lynching. Look at this crowd gathered around. And of course, you have a poor, again, I have no idea whether these people are guilty or not. It doesn't matter whether they're guilty at this point. Look at this little girl watching it. Look at that, the smile, the sense of satisfaction she has. Why? Because her whole life, she has been told these Black men are bad men. They are terrible people. She feels, I am being protected. That man won't rape me again. She has no idea what the reality might be. And again, the image you see here on the lower right, you see this young girl and another young kid. In this case, they look traumatized. They're going to remember this the rest of their life. Let me go back to this initial image. If you go back, you see the couple holding hands. And what's really scary about images like this is, again, these people think they're doing the right thing. That is what's so disturbing to me. They don't think they're being evil. They think they're doing the right thing. They think they are the good people. They don't think they're the bad people. That is what is so scary about this, is that they have been implanted with these ideas their whole lives, their parents, their grandparents, to the point that they can do something like this and think they're doing good. This is probably the most famous lynching, Claude Neal's lynching in Marietta, Florida, also 1935, very similar to the lynching that would happen here in Gainesville. Again, another one, a person that was castrated and penis put in their mouth. To me, this is probably the most disturbing lynching image. You can see, again, a burnt body and a crowd smiling at this, proud that they have done this. There's another crowd watching a lynching. Whites gather for miles to slay Negroes. Again, this is not done in secret. People knew about this. The press knew about it. There's the image I was trying to find, a couple smiling, holding hands during a lynching. There's actually 3 bodies in this image. You can see the crowd smiling, proud to be there. There's not many images from Southwest Georgia, but there is this image of Gus Goodman. And by the way, not that it makes a difference, but he was actually guilty of crime. He literally shot the sheriff who eventually died, and then he was lynched. But think about how this might have affected those people at the bottom of the image. You know, people who may have thought, well, I might, maybe I'll challenge Jim Crow. You see a lynch and you think, no, I never will. And again, I have a lot of Georgia images here on purpose. Postcards. People would mail this in the mail, proud that they went to one of these lynchings. Some people did speak out against this. There was a talk, but very little was done, unfortunately. Even today, there's still officially no law against lynching. There's laws against murder and things like that, but not officially against lynching. It is against the law to lynch, but nonetheless, they never have passed an anti-lynching law. We talked about riots against Black communities. We mentioned Wilmington. We mentioned Atlanta. I briefly mentioned Rosewood. That happened in 1923. And this happened elsewhere. We see 3 or 4 other cities in Florida taken off the map. And every state in the South has cities, small towns really, but Black communities that were completely wiped out. This happened over and over and over. I don't know, all of these images bother me, but some reason this one gets me the most. This is not a lynching. This is even post World War II, but it's just a bunch of young teens beating up a young African-American male because he was in the wrong place. He was in a white-only area, so they decided to beat him up. Finally, you get the Emmett Till murder. let me tell this. I'm going to try to tell as quick as I can. This will be the last thing I talk about it. And some people debate whether this is a lynching or just simply a murder. And I would really call this a murder. By 1955, Jim Crow is still around. It's maybe not as bad as it was. I think the height of Jim Crow really was about the 1920s. Throughout the 30s and 40s, things got a little bit better. Lynchings basically went away. But 1955, there's still Jim Crow. The civil rights movement has not happened yet. In fact, Emmett Till's murder is very similar to in 2020, what people look at George Floyd's murder. In other words, a murder that sparked a movement. And I know we're not sure exactly where this movement's going in 2020, but in 1955, this murder sparked the civil rights movement. This happened after World War II. This happened after the Nazis were defeated in America. So very quickly, Emmett Till was he was 13. He was born in Mississippi. His father abandoned him, went off to the military, died. By all accounts, was not a good guy. His mother, her name was Mamie, not Mammy, but Mamie, M-A-M-I-E. She decided to take her and her son and move to Chicago in the 40s. And so he grew up in Chicago. Finally, he's 13. He said, look, I got family in Mississippi. I've never really been there. I want to go to see my family in Mississippi for the summer. And she reluctantly said, okay. But she told him over and over again, Chicago may not be great, but it's better than Mississippi. Be careful, be careful, be careful. In fact, this photograph you see is a photograph taken right before he left. There's a couple of these, and he's dressed up. And she gave him a special ring to make sure he would remember her advice. Off he went. So he's in Money, Mississippi. And he and his cousins one day went to the Bryant's grocery store to get some snacks and probably a soda. And the wife of the owner, Carolyn Bryant, was running the counter. There's some debate over exactly what happened, but by most accounts, he whistled at her. Some people argue that he even said something a little rude to her, but whatever. And then they ran out. And of course, she was white. When they got outside, his cousins were like, Emmett, you can't do that. And he probably at that point knew he screwed up. He's 13. 13-year-old boys do dumb things. And he goes, I don't care. I got white girlfriends back home. So what? And they went off about their business. This is Carolyn Bryant, the woman that he probably whistled at. Anyway, that night, because people in town heard about it. Hey, you hear what that black boy from Chicago did? Anyway, that night at his uncle Moses Williams' house, this is the family he's staying with, a car drives up, two white men get out. One is Mr. Bryant. The other man is his brother-in-law. They knock on the door and they say, we want that boy from Chicago. Moses Wright goes and gets 13-year-old Emmett Till, and they turn to the car and say, honey, is that him? And a woman, probably Carolyn Bryant, she's denied this, said, yeah, that's him. Okay, you coming with us? And they drove off in the middle of the night, and Emmett Till was never seen alive again. Everybody knew what probably happened. He was killed. No body, no witnesses to the murder. A few weeks go by. Finally, a body is found floating in the Tallahatchie River. It had been tied to a cotton gin wheel, but the body had kind of gotten out and floated to the top. It was unrecognizable, though. But everybody knew it was Emmett Till. His mother had already, because he's disappeared, she's in Mississippi trying to find him. She goes to the coroner's office, and the ring on his finger is how she identified him. So now you have a motive. You have two people who last saw him alive, and now you have a body. The guy on the right is the husband. The guy on the left is the brother-in-law. So there's going to be a trial now. And so his mother did something that hadn't been done before. She decided, I'm going to talk to the press. We're going to talk about this. I'm going to have an open casket at the funeral. I want America to see what happened to my son. These are some of the images of her at the funeral. So she had an open casket and invited everybody to come, including the press. So this is Emmett Till right before he left Chicago. This is Emmett Till at the funeral. And it's one of the worst images you're ever going to see, probably. This is segregation. This is Jim Crow. This is what it actually looks like. This is what power looks like. What this kid did was whistle at a white woman. And this is what happened to him. He was beaten, then shot in the back of the head, and then dumped in a river for whistling at a white woman because he was Black. Segregation is not separate water fountains. Segregation is not separate restrooms. Segregation is about power. One group overpowering another group and oppressing that other group. That is what segregation is. And on one level, I apologize for keeping this image up on the screen so long. On the other hand, I do not. That is, no more whitewashing. And I've been showing that for years. But the story doesn't end there. So by the 1950s, things are different. There is a Black press now, magazines like Ebony and Jet, and they're talking about it. And they're not letting it go. So there is a trial again. So the two men are tried by a jury of their peers. This is Mississippi in the 1950s, all white, all male. Moses Wright does testify. In fact, on the right, that's an image of him testifying. He testifies, says, yes, those two men came to my house and took Emmett Till away. Then he drove off and he never came back. He went to Chicago and never came back to Mississippi. Despite the evidence, overwhelming evidence, they were found not guilty. So this is the two men and their wives celebrating the not guilty verdict. Because this is America and you cannot be tried for the same crimes twice, that would be double jeopardy, they could admit that they did it. And in the media, in Look magazine, that's exactly what they did. They told everybody. That's how I knew that he was beaten up and shot in the back of the head, because they told everybody that's what they did. The murder was shocking. The funeral was even more shocking. But what absolutely changed things was the admission. That's what changed everything. Even if you were a racist, you were a white racist in Atlanta, even if you supported segregation, it was hard to say, yes, I support the killing of a 13-year-old for whistling at a white woman. It is that big of a deal. To me, it's the end of segregation in a way. It's the beginning of the end. It's also the beginning of the civil rights movement. This is the transition moment, the Emmett Till murder. That's why I sometimes do it in my civil rights lecture. Sometimes I do it in this one. I went ahead and did it in this one this semester. By the way, Carolyn Bryant, as far as I know, I just looked it up just a couple months ago. She was still alive. She's her elderly day, but she is still here. And fairly recently did admit that she lied. She had insinuated to her husband that Emmett Till had actually grabbed her with her hand, and and she said, no, I lied about that. That didn't actually happen. And so today, I'm not trying to take sides here, but today when we're arguing about race and we're arguing about history and people want to take down statues and stuff, and I have to be honest, as a historian, when I see this, I don't like Confederate statues. That's my own opinion, but I also don't like vandalism and stuff. So it's not an easy conversation on either side. I don't know what the right answer is, but hopefully you do get a sense that this stuff does run deep, but yet the things that happened a long time ago, oh, my little light just went out. My vanity light just went out. Sorry. But basically saying you're talking way too much. And this is the last slide. We are talking about stuff that happened 100 years ago or 70 years ago, but the effects of what happened, we can still feel today. And I do think you guys needed this background to at least understand what the debates are. You don't have to agree with one side or the other, but at least to understand the debates. And I know this was an unbelievably long lecture. Hopefully you hit pause a bunch of times and didn't do it all in one day. But thank you for listening. And that's it. Thank you, guys.